Thank you very much, Joe, for that introduction. So Justin Field will be joining us. They've had a very late vote on a bill in Parliament. So he has left Parliament and he's on his way. So as Joe mentioned, I do have a background of growing up in a family impacted by gambling. It's useful to give that context before I go on with other things. So we actually moved to a small country town when I was quite young, still in primary school. I was 8 years old. And the local club was the centre of the community there, and that obviously is the place where my mother developed a gambling addiction. What that resulted in was basically a pretty challenging childhood. I left home when I was 17 with a lot of stress-related health issues, some pretty appalling school results, and pretty much a permanently fractured family. We haven't really recovered. And I also took with me a fairly packed agenda for many psychologists and counsellors for over the years. So the impacts do last a lifetime. It would be some 20 years after I left home that I found myself living in Argentina and watching the election campaign of 2010, which those of you who are politically engaged, which is why you're here, will remember was the hung parliament, where there were certain deals made with independents, one of whom was Andrew Wilkie, the independent from Tasmania, who made an agreement around some poker machine reform. So that really got my attention. So the next time a friend of mine visited me in Argentina and sent me a message asking me for my usual care package. I don't know, anyone lived abroad, you'd usually get a care package, and mine consisted of Tim Tams, chicken chips, cherry ripes, and the Productivity Commission report into gambling. So my friend came over with these volumes of Productivity Commission report and handed them over, thought I was crazy, and then I buried myself in them, and all 1,110 pages. And what happened really was sickened me. I was actually physically ill when I got part way through it, because I came to this realisation that this problem was huge, and it wasn't just my family or my family's experience, and there was so much more to it. There was the product, the environment, the bigger picture of regulation, politics and industry. And I know Justin's going to... Thanks, Justin. Oh, no, that's not Justin. I know Justin's going to talk more about the industry and politics of it, so I'll try and not go down that path just yet. The other thing I did was really speak to as many people as I could who had experienced a gambling addiction, so I could understand their perspectives. I joined groups online. I met with people when I came to Australia. And I pretty much decided then that it was time for me to move home and try and do something about it. So the thing, I got more than I bargained for when I did the research, and basically the best way you can describe these poker machines is, you know, people call them the crack cocaine of gambling, and there's good reason for that. It is addiction by design, and it's quite dangerous. But what I thought I would do is, we often jump to solution mode, and I think it's worthwhile just really recapping and looking at some of the perspective around the history and how we got here. So poker machines were actually introduced in New South Wales in 1956, so we were the first state to get them. They were the old one-arm bandits, which have then progressed on to the high-intensity and highly technical machines that they are today, and then into pubs in the 1990s and other states in the 1990s as well. Where we stand today in terms of losses, so overall gambling losses in Australia are currently 24 billion per year. Now, yeah, it's a lot, right? Yeah. So, and then 24 billion, 2 minutes away. 24 billion per year. That makes us second in a list of countries, but like that's still double the next country of Singapore. More than 12 billion of that is on poker machines. And in New South Wales, 6.3 of that is ours and rising. So the latest Treasury forecasts are projecting an increase there. So I think The Economist described us internationally as the world's biggest losers. Yeah. So to put it into perspective, this is another sort of perspective thing I think we need to be aware of. We have 195,000 machines in Australia. 95,000 of those are in New South Wales. The statistic that really, I think, gives the best perspective around how things are different for us is that of all the world's poker machines that exist outside of casinos, Australia has 76% of those. So those are the machines in our pubs and clubs, and that was named in the Productivity Commission report as the main thing that was the real problem, was just the sheer number and accessibility of them. So really we're an outlier in the world, and we need to turn that around. The thing I came to think about, so there are other features of the machine. So our machines are designed quite dangerously. The best term I used, described by someone who was a former gambler, said, "I consented to play a machine. I didn't consent to unlawful hypnotism." And so when I considered that, and that coupled with that, in New South Wales you can bet $10 per push, whereas the other states, the next nearest is $5 per spin, and the Productivity Commission recommended $1 bets. So every few seconds you can bet $10. You can load up $7,500 into a machine through a note acceptor at one time. So where this is for me is that I see is that we have these dangerous, addictive, hypnotic machines that are simultaneously, so removing people's agency and simultaneously relieving them of large amounts of cash through, like paper through a shredder. 30% of people who actually use machines regularly become addicted to a moderate or severe level, which is significant. That doesn't take into account the lower levels of harm that we know exist. 40% of revenue comes from those with a severe level, and further 20% from that moderate level. So we know that 60% of revenue comes from significant levels of problem gambling. The other thing, because that's all quite statistical and there's a lot of figures and facts and figures which are quite stunning, but there is also the human side and the level of impact and harm. So for every person with a gambling problem, 5 to 10 others are affected. So that's family members, friends, colleagues, children like me, although I'm not a kid anymore, but children like me, which means that we're really looking up to at least 5 million people impacted at any point in time, and that isn't even taking into account the lifetime of impacts. There has also been recently more talk around crime. So there was a study released in 2016 by Warfield and Associates who looked at fraud-related crime related to gambling. And quite a big chunk of it was in relation to poker machines, but I think the statistic that really stood out for me was that 81% of people who did commit fraud-related crime are first-time offenders of any kind and would never have found their way into the justice system if it hadn't been for their poker machine addiction. There's also a strong correlation between gambling and family violence. There's been research around postcodes with that have a higher number of poker machines also report a higher incidence of family violence. And this is where it gets really serious, which is suicide. So there's a study that found that found 1 in 5 people presenting to a Melbourne hospital for attempted suicide were people with a gambling problem. And the Productivity Commission back in 2010, things are worse since now, back in 2010, estimated that at least there were 400 suicides per year as a result of gambling. Poker machines also have a disproportionate impact on women. So what we do know is that prior to the introduction of poker machines in Australia, women represented 10% of people with a gambling problem. And that rose to 40 to 60% after the introduction of poker machines. And 90% of them were due to pokies. So when I think about all of this as well, and I know there's really big discussions at the moment around wellbeing, and particularly in corporate organisations, etc., is that we look at these sort of pillars of wellbeing. G'day, welcome. It's great timing. I've only got a couple of minutes left. So when I think about the pillars, what we call the pillars of wellbeing, there's kind of 4 main things really when we think about individuals' wellbeing. One is financial wellbeing. Another is health, which is both mental and physical health. The other is career and work. And then the final one really is around community and connection and relationships. And what strikes me about this issue is that it really profoundly impacts all of those factors of wellbeing. So I've just given them all the stats and impacts and things like that. So finally, what I wanted to touch on is, well, what do we want? You know, the Alliance for Game. I've just given you all of those horrible statistics and impacts and harm. And really what we want to do is that we want, we're shifting the conversation. One that shifts from responsible gambling, which you'll talk more about, Justin, but one about gambling harm. And what we really want to see is a public health approach. So, for example, if we know that 30% of people who use a poker machine end up with quite a significant problem, if that was our water supply, if that was our road toll, if that was anything else, we would take a whole of system approach to protect those people and those people around them. So we want to shift the focus from the individual to the product. We want to look at harms to the whole of population. So not just that severe end of harm either. Like, what we know is that 3/4 of people, so if you've got 4 people sitting in front of a poker machine, 3 of them are experiencing some level of harm. So in terms of a prevention and reduction model as well as treatment, what we would like to see, because we always hear from a politician, whenever you ask them a question, well, not Justin, of course, oops. No, like when we hear from the major parties around this and we ask them, they always focus on treatment. They'll always come back and say, we are doing everything we can to help problem gamblers. And that term in itself really puts the problem back onto the gambler rather than the product. So what we want to do is we want some prevention. So we want to actually remove addictive and dangerous design features. There are a raft of them which I won't bore you with now, but they are all of those features that cause people to actually have a distorted perception of what is happening between them and the machine. We do want some harm minimisation. So obviously when people have already kind of fallen off that cliff, we need a bit of an airbag, or we need some speed limits, so at least maximum $1 bets. And we would like to see reduction, harm reduction, not just harm management. So community empowerment really is at the heart of that. So communities have more of a say about poker machines in their local area. So this really is about changing the system. The other thing that we need to do, and I know you'll talk more about the industry, but I'll just touch on it briefly, which is we really do need to still keep the industry in focus. I mean, they've been on steroids for the last, 50 years at least, and it's very little regulation, or it's regulated on their terms. So I would actually call it at the moment a huge protection racket. Like, we've really got to expose them. We really have to hold them to account and keep the focus on them to do that. We need to challenge the idea that it's a not-for-profit industry, because so many clubs have it, because they're making huge amounts of cash off the back of misery and pain and loss. Yet somehow their club managers end up with really huge salaries and they can afford political donations. And whatever justification they provide, we need to actually stop accepting that as a trade-off. So community good, none of it is an acceptable trade-off for the impacts to people like me and my family and the hundreds of thousands of us. And really, I guess what I would really like to see, and we would really like to see with the industry, is that we get to the point, like we are with tobacco right now, so that when they actually respond to or reject any kind of reform, the community just does a big collective eye roll and just doesn't really, give them any kind of level of credibility. So that's really all from me. I'll pass over to Justin. You're going to talk about the political and industry context. Yep.